Hello, my name is Anatoly Motkin. I'm president of StrategEast, and today the issue of our StrategEast live session is open data in Eurasia during COVID-19 pandemic. Open data projects implemented during the pandemic have reminded again to the Eurasian countries' governments on the importance of releasing any possible amount of data for free public access. Most of the local virus spread tracking apps have been developed based on the open data use, and some of the vaccines against COVID-19 are being developed on the basis of the open data. How can Eurasian countries take a historic chance and make open data a significant component of economic growth and social development? So first, let me introduce our distinguished guests. Unfortunately, Prasanna Laldas from World Bank was unable today to join us at the last minute. First, let me introduce Pavel Koktyshev. He's Deputy Chairman of Board of Zerde International Infocommunication Holding, Kazakhstan. Dr. Juliet McMurren, Specialist on Open Government, SecDev Group. And Kateryna Onyiliogwu, Open Data Team Lead, the USAID and UKAID Transparency and Accountability in Public Administration and Services. So first, thank you for joining us, and let me ask you, Dr. McMurren. So you just finished your project together with World Bank, dedicated to open data, and what could you share in regard of COVID-19? So what are the most interesting cases that you found there, and what is the most interesting findings of the research in whole?
Thanks very much. Today I wanted to talk about how open data has been used for COVID-19 response worldwide, and that's based on recent research that we've done for the World Bank in support of its digital resilience program for the Kyrgyz Republic. And this is part of a broader engagement that the World Bank has in the region, supporting the capacity of governments to advance opening government data and to build government capacity to do that. So at the moment, there is a project which is in Uzbekistan, for example, putting together a paper showcasing a dozen different types of non-health solutions to address challenges faced particularly by vulnerable populations in education, by entrepreneurs, using open data. So this is part of a broader scope of projects dealing with open data in Central Asia. Today, what I'd like to talk about is why open data matters for crisis response, how it's being used based on the research that we've done, and where, and to give you some examples of use cases for the potential uses of open data for COVID-19. I'd also like to talk about some of its limitations and how it can be made more useful and more valuable for crisis response. What I'd say overall is that open data has been widely and effectively used to help track and contain the spread of COVID-19 and to manage its economic and social impacts. And there are models out there for doing even more with data to aid crisis response, which I'll talk about later. So why does open data matter? We're seeing three factors that are beginning to emerge as important parts of successful responses. The first is speed. Countries that move to respond quickly seem to have done better to contain disease spread. Stringency of response. Countries that mounted strong responses seem to have done better overall. And trust. Good communication, transparency, trust in institutions are hallmarks of more successful responses, in part because they seem to encourage better compliance with public health measures. And open data is an enabler of all three of these. It enables speed and stringency by helping governments understand what and where the needs are. And we should remember here that governments are among the largest consumers of their own open data. And it enables trust in institutions as part of a wider commitment to transparent, accountable, and participatory government. I should add as a caution that although some of the data-driven responses we've looked at are exciting and they're innovative, we won't know definitively what made the difference in terms of COVID-19 responses until the crisis is resolved. But there is a broader body of use cases on open data for crisis response worldwide that does demonstrate its value. So how is open data being used for COVID-19 response worldwide? What we've seen is that there are three types of use cases directly addressing the disease itself. And the first and most common is for monitoring the spread of the disease. These use cases leverage open government health and other data to do things like mapping disease spread, identifying populations at risk, providing consumer health information, increasing the resilience of the health system. You'll notice that I haven't mentioned tracing contacts, and we'll come back to that later since that's a special use case. The majority of the use cases that we looked at and that are out there are associated with disease monitoring directly. Many countries, many research institutions, many multilateral organizations have dashboards and maps showing the current status of confirmed, active, and recovered cases, the number of tests, and the number of fatalities. And I think everybody by this stage is familiar with the Johns Hopkins and World Health Organization dashboards, which are built on open data that's being released daily by public health authorities. And that's often in combination with open geospatial, demographic, or electoral data. These are critically important open data tools, platforms that are constantly being used by governments, the media, academia, and citizens to assess the current situation, both in terms of cases and in terms of the health system's capacity to keep up, to plan next steps, to hold governments accountable for their response or lack of it, and to expose inaction in some cases and failure to test. The majority of these examples are national, but some cities like Seoul, for example, have their own dashboards. Open data can also do a lot more to help contain the spread of the virus and to understand how the progress of the pandemic by helping public health agencies foresee where people are most at risk, for example. And these include mapping projects that show areas and populations most at risk of either exposure or poor outcomes from COVID-19 because of variables like having an older or a sicker population with more underlying resilience use cases deploy open data to ensure that people can meet their basic needs for food, shelter, and income during the pandemic. And this is a particular concern for vulnerable populations without secure or permanent housing. In Vancouver, in BC, in Canada, for example, the local health authorities used open data from a variety of sources to map the location of food, hygiene facilities, and medical care for people living on the streets in downtown Vancouver. And as far as economic resilience applications go, these are directed towards identifying and mitigating economic impacts and recognizing and promoting signs of recovery. And here a good example would be another mapping initiative from the US, which uses the Bureau of Labor unemployment statistics, to map low-income job losses from COVID-19, again at the census tract level, so it's quite granular. And it provides a breakdown of how many low-income jobs in which sectors have been lost during the pandemic and where they have been lost. So those are some of the examples of where and how open data is being used to support pandemic responses in disease monitoring, in social resilience, and in economic resilience. These have the potential to be really useful and powerful tools that can help government and citizens and civil society and the private sector respond to a major public health crisis. They're built on data that had either already been collected and opened, or where the facility to collect and open it, in the case of the disease data, already existed. And that points us to one of the risks and the limitations of open data for this kind of use, which is that the data we need may not be collected or open, it may not be able to be opened, or it may be held by organizations that don't have the capacity or the willingness to open it. Particularly with health data, there is the risk of exposing personally identifying information, and this is a real risk, something that we saw in South Korea, where COVID-19 patients were identified on the base of anonymized data that had been publicly released. And they were doxxed, they were harassed online because they were able to be identified through that data. In most cases, because of concerns about the potential for identification, we don't have access to very granular information about patients, only aggregated data at a population level. And in many cases, what public health agencies would wish to know would require a more granular level of data. One solution that's already in widespread use is to go beyond open data alone to projects that involve trusted data sharing, what's been termed data collaboratives. And these involve the sharing of non-open data, sometimes in combination with open data, between participants from different sectors to create a product or tool. The data itself is not opened, but it's able to be shared and used to create public goods. That sharing may be direct, or it may take place through an intermediary. And it requires, obviously, very strong data privacy and governance models, although there are examples of how this can be done safely. And this is where the contact tracing apps come in, because pretty much universally, these involve the bringing together of non-open data sources, such as telecommunications data or location-based services through smartphones, and patient health data to provide information on potential exposure to COVID-19. To give one example here, the Danish contact tracing app used closed telecommunication data gathered through a Bluetooth-enabled app to notify citizens of the frequency and duration of their contacts, and to inform Danish health authorities of citizen adherence to physical distancing. And the way that that was done was through Statistics Denmark, which is a highly trusted agency within Denmark for its stance on data protection. And it has increasingly begun to act as a data intermediary. And what it did here was to aggregate the mobile data and ensure it was privacy compliant. And it said that it could have even increased the value of the data further without sacrificing privacy by building in individual statistical data before providing it in de-identified form to public health agencies. And this last point really highlights one of the truths of data-driven responses, that there's a multiplier effect involved. When multiple data sources can be brought together, the value is greater than the sum of the individual parts. So what I'd like to close with is the idea that it's not either open data or data collaboratives, it's both and. Open data is invaluable. It will always be necessary to provide situational awareness in crises. In a pandemic, to show us where we are, what capacity we have to respond at a macro level, and to create useful tools. But data collaboratives, in addition, provide us with ways to use other parts of the universe of data that we can't open to create tools or products we otherwise couldn't.
Thank you. Dr. McMurren. And Kateryna, I have a question addressed to you because, your name is associated, I think most of all with open data in Ukraine. So, and we know that with all your initiatives and opening the information, it was quite helpful, not only for COVID-19, but the wholesale development of open data projects in Ukraine. Some of them we have discussed within our forum in Kyiv last year. So please, could you present what are the best cases of open data projects, open data-based projects in Ukraine these days? You should unmute yourself.
Yes, here we go. Thank you for inviting me. Actually, when we talk about COVID-19 open data, usually we hear about medical data. But where I would like to focus, it's not about medical data, but about two other cases that are like favorite mine, and I think the strongest in Ukraine right now. So when we talk about crisis, we see that a lot of governments created special funds to spend money to buy medical equipment, which will help to fight the virus and help people. And as we see, we have a lot of procurement done, buying those goods and materials and masks, gloves, whatever it's needed to do that. And first, the question we need to ask, especially in a country with resources, is how is money being spent on those things, right? We need to think at first of all about transparency, accountability of how these limited resources are being spent. So big role plays here procurement data. In Ukraine, obviously, a lot of, it's the most famous system, ProZorro, procurement system, where you can see all the procurement is done by government for years. Has collected enormous amount of data. And actually, when the crisis hit and we see a lot of government doing a lot of procurement, that's where, and we see that, well, government buys a lot of stuff, but still people not always see the changes. Like you don't see that more masks became available at the hospital. People don't necessarily see, or for example, being told that, oh, we don't have enough of those. So it's very important that every citizen can actually check how the local hospital is spending money, right? Because this is a part of the trust of citizens to the government, to know that the government money is well spent and they know how they spend in particular hospitals. So thanks to that fact that ProZorro accumulates a large amount of open data, a lot of our open data community actually immediately started creating dashboards, maps, all sorts of tools. It's not about tool per se, right? But it's about the use of the data to make sure that citizens are actually capable to see the money spending on those mask, gloves, and so on. And actually, I checked my favorite tools, the ones that I use every day, as not as an open data specialist, but as a just a citizen of Ukraine who is sitting in quarantine right now. For example, I use one map which shows all tenders on amount of 3 and 6 billion of Ukrainian hryvnias. That's a lot of money. And I think first thing, especially in our region, especially in the region where we have a long history of corruption risks in particular spheres, particularly in procurement, it's great to see that all this hard work that's been done before by collecting procurement data actually is paying off in this kind of when the crisis hit, because now the data is available to analyze about the procurement. So this is like my first major case, that when we think about open data in the time of current crisis, it's not about medical data. It's also about procurement data. It's about transparency of those money the government spends to fight the crisis and help people to overcome the crisis. It's number one. Number two, I think we hear a lot about socioeconomic impact, negative impact that had the crisis, right? So it's not about medical emergency only. We talk about that business was hit, right? So we hear how women got women have disadvantages when they sit at home, and we have a lot of cases when women actually suffer being in quarantine at home. So, right, we need to think about socioeconomic impact. And here we have data as well. We need to think, what is the open data that exists that can analyze and see a real picture of this negative impact. Let's say we talk about business, right? So first question, no, it's not first question, but like first point. If your country has open business register, and actually it's not one of those registers that is open in our region. We have not that many countries who have business register open. You actually can monitor and analyze how many, if the number of businesses and individual entrepreneurs has been up or down. You can see the whole dynamic of these registrations. For example, you can analyze what was before, how it's happening, and how the measures for example, the measures of quarantine that government regulates, changes, and so on, how they impact on those things. So, for example, one of my favorite projects in Ukraine, it's called Open Data Bot. It's the bot that provides to the citizens, and particularly the other businesses, provide information on other businesses. So who is the owner of the business, and collects the information from different registers, court register, I don't know, I mean, any information about business unit, it analyzes and provides in a few seconds to other business owners, so you can check to whom you are making business with. And actually this company, as actually best aggregator of business data in Ukraine, they started from the first day of the crisis. They started analyzing of how the crisis impacted the business. For example, they used open data from business register to analyze interpreters and the businesses, how they open, how they close. And actually they showed that only from the start of the crisis for this many weeks, and in Ukraine we have quarantine for like, I think 2.5 months. Since that period, only now we see that the data shows that the registration numbers return to the start of the crisis, right? So we have different changes in numbers and this is a good signal for the government, a good data for the government to actually understand how can we help business. Because if you really need to make a decision to help business to overcome the crisis, you need good data for decision making. So for this reason, this is one of my favorite cases as well. And actually, I really like to support the previous speaker about not open data, but data in general, because government doesn't have capacity or capabilities to actually collect all the data in the world that it needs, right? So a lot of business collects great data. And I think in the times of crisis, this is a good opportunity where these two, where business and government can collaborate. And what I see in some kind of analysis provided that, for example, impact of crisis on restaurant business, or how the crisis impacted the cost of the rent of housing in Kiev. So, for example, we can see that in thanks to the business data from business, we see that the price went down for the whole period of the quarantine. So this is real numbers, real data to actually support, overcome socioeconomic impact of the crisis. So we really need to think about what I'm trying to say, that we really need to think beyond medical data and focus on in the parallel, also focus on procurement data, on business data, and so on, because we really need to understand how deep the crisis is and which are stakeholders that are affected the most. And actually, the last thing what I like or what's happening in Ukraine is that we see that, like, in Ukraine, we have lots of innovation. We have great IT community. We have great activists. Open data community is pretty strong in Ukraine. And I think this is the strength of our country in general in the region, that our open data community is massive. And actually, we've seen the surge of innovation, and we see that all around the world, in different countries, we see hackathons, we can see challenges, competitions, all these kind of things where people start to organize themselves to create some IT solutions, not just based on open data and open data as well, but also just IT solutions that can help. And actually in Ukraine is not exception. In Ukraine, the Ministry of the Digital Transformation ran special competition, Hack Corona Challenge. Hack Corona Challenge, it already happened, and actually just in 3 days, Ministry of Digital Transformation collected 800 ideas from the citizens. Usually when you run a competition, you might get maybe 200, 300, and you collect these ideas for like a few weeks. Here, just in few days, around 800 ideas were collected. And actually, this kind of competitions really support innovation, because in the times of crisis, I think people become twice more innovative with their resources and their capabilities. And actually, what an interesting thing that I note, competition, I was one of the juries in the competition. I helped to organize the whole competition. I noticed that actually teams who won, they were the ones who are gonna support community with the socioeconomic effect, right? So we have, for example, project who is gonna develop audiobooks for school children. So school children, for example, they have to stay at home, study at home. It's complicated for parents. It's complicated for children, and because children it's hard for them to concentrate and so on. It's totally different experience than, for example, when you're in classroom. So one of those things is you need to prepare for exam, and the books can be also audiobooks. You have to be people. It's something that become more popular as more time goes, and we see this kind of projects who are winning. And also, for example, another project that I really liked who won was the marketplace for the farmers, because farmers, they lost the opportunity to sell their products in the market outside. They don't have websites, they don't have social media developed. They are not that kind of business who managed to switch their sales online. it's only large companies who have online presence and who was able actually to sell their products online and kind of change the way they sell it. But for the small farmers, it's not there. So, for example, one of the projects is developing a marketplace for farmers to sell their produce. So, in this case, my point is, let's when we talk about open data in the crisis period of COVID, we need to think also not just about medical data. We need to think about procurement data, about business data. We need to think about which impact it has actually, and analyze this data and provide for the government the useful insights of how to tackle this crisis, because the impact of the crisis will feel for a really long time. Nobody knows how long, but everybody knows that for the long period. We just don't know exactly when it ends. So in our country, I think that in our region, these key registers has to be open, and we need to put more effort in the future for them to be open and to be ready for any kind of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Kateryna. And to you, Pavel, Kazakhstan was the first country in Central Asia which with an open government initiative. So I would like to address you a question first. How does it work? As I remember, it was Digital Kazakhstan, or it was 2020, or Information Kazakhstan was 2020. So how the program was implemented? What are the new initiatives in the open data field are planned to be implemented in the future years? And actually now, again, COVID is something global. So maybe you could tell about some initiative that you have implemented in Kazakhstan and which assisted you to overcome the consequences of this crisis. Please unmute. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Really great examples was made by my colleagues. So right to your questions, with regards to the open data project, it became part of the e-government platform back in 2016. Like prior to that, of course, like National Statistic Agency was collecting a lot of data. National Bank was publicized a lot of like reports back then. So, and since 2016, we realized that different state agencies and like ministries publish more than 3,539 data sets. And the relevance of the public data, like accuracy of this data is over 92%. So, but at the same time, just in the last couple of years, we were like tracking the rise of like usage of this data, because prior to the initial years, it was a very low interest from the public sector, like from the NGOs, like business, and yeah. So it was a part of the previous Information Kazakhstan 2020, the program, but now we are initiated the updated version of the national digital strategy called Digital Kazakhstan. And of course, like we integrated a lot of previous like experience into the new program. So I believe the whole concept of it was like important start for like and doing a leapfrog kind of effect, jumping into the new concept called the big data analysis, right? And for today, I really want to emphasize that it's really important to talk from the technical standpoint. So, of course, there is a consensus that the government release as much data as possible, and there is a consensus there within Kazakhstan, and I heard a lot of great examples from Kateryna, from Juliet, and it's without a doubt it's important things. But at the next stage, we overwhelmed with that data. that is not actually initially gathered by the government. So just let's take the mobile operators as an example. So how much data they collecting today that's really relevant to this current crisis mitigation, or how it could be used for the others kind of other projects. Kazakhstan now introduced the new platform called Smart Data Komet. It means smart data government. So it's an integration platform, just making happen this all different sort of information system from different agencies and ministries to upload the data in the data lake. That's then we can make easier access from all stakeholders. So we ease the government again. The COVID situation speeds up a lot of processes here as well. So usually there is a 10 tendencies or like conflicts between like security, data security issue, national security agenda, and the data availability. So of course it's usually back and forth between like security agencies and a lot of like public sector, mass media. And now during the crisis, I can admit that actually the open data win over over the national security agenda and issues, because now we understand that if we are uploading as much information and giving it available to the professionals, let's say economists, disease experts, like that can project on this data a lot of suggestions and the projects, or it's much more valuable at the end of the day than just trying to keep the gene within the box, yes, within the lab. So actually, the new again, and it's a very important step for many countries to do extra investment into updating their platforms, updating their infrastructure, because you can imagine that first iterations of information system, they was built in all very old technologies and very old kind of programming languages, for example, and so on and so. A lot of problems coming around. So, but today the COVID actually bring us to the consensus with a lot of specifically in the case of Kazakhstan, with our Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy, that before the crisis was very reluctant to do extensive investment into infrastructure update. Now there is a consensus that we should do a leapfrog, like build, for example, the smart data bridge. It's an integration platform just to make this happen. From technological standpoint, of course, all these new fancy startups, they wouldn't work with the old technologies or all the new research. They will not go to the traditional paperwork. The all modern kind of startups, experts, they're too lazy to go for the archives, like paper archives. They want some very easy access to this information. And in the, I just want to add some technological angle to our discussion. I really appreciate the insights from Juliet, from Kateryna, but at the same time, we need to admit that we should invest into the infrastructure or update the infrastructure to make this happen. And Kazakhstan made a great case studies as well in the last couple of months since inception of since the since lockdown. So and yeah, just in the first 2 weeks of lockdown, with support of this integration platform that was initiated by the Ministry of Digital Development, 57 apps and different microservices emerged just in 2 weeks. And let's say Kateryna was given an example of social support, like, yeah, so the availability of this integration platform was made this happen just to deliver support to over 2 million citizens of Kazakhstan in this very challenging time. So, and of course, it's again about availability of data. Of course, it's mitigation was much easier. I cannot imagine what kind of problems we could face if this prerequisite wasn't made a few years ago. But nowadays, for sure, we should speed up the process.
Well, thank you for your observation and for the understanding that today even the bureaucracy is eager to assist to your activity. But if I would like to ask you as one short example, something very specific, what was the technological solution that has been developed thanks to this collaboration with the bureaucratic agencies that exist in Kazakhstan or any other post-Soviet country that we know, please?
There is a special app, and the capital city introduced the lockdown, the first city in the country. So, and the second one was Almaty. So both cities operating their kind of app that initially was introduced just to make this communication between the municipality and the citizens. But during the first days, they introduced the live map of the contact persons with the COVID. So the air companies and the airport within Astana, within capital city, they introduced the special monitoring and the face recognition options. And we have a video surveillance network within the city that was also plugged in after just in 1 week of lockdown. So they effectively actually mapped out the first contact people, and they made it possible to first reactions. And the second issue, just in 2 days at the e-government platform and Jobs Bank, National Jobs Bank, we introduced a special service just to apply for money support from the government for people in need. They used different options like Telegram chatbots and Facebook chatbots just to reroute the just not to make the overload the main system. eGov platform was faced enormous like number of requests, and of course the first step, the second step was just to reroute the application through the different channels. So, and it was again the success cases within Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Pavel, and back to you, Dr. McMurren. Actually, I would like to address the same question maybe to all of you, because thank you for your perspective and overview on what happens on global scale and local scale, both Ukraine and Kazakhstan. But there are always some obstacles for governments or other institutions to share the information. Sometimes it's a concern to share the information because of different, it could be authoritarian or just control freak reasons that many governments are natural to many. On the other hand, it's a lack of interest. Sometimes in Ukraine, for example, some people or some institutions sit over those registries and just trade with this information. So they don't have just commercially don't have interest to share this information with others. So what could be the incentives? And I would address this question to each one of them, so some of you will have some time to think about. But from your perspective on global scale, Dr. McMurren, what actually are the incentives both for the governments and big commercial institutions to share the data, and to even if they do it pro bono, please?
That's a very good question, and the cultural issues are always one of the most difficult obstacles to get over. I think you're absolutely correct in identifying that commercial organizations and governments don't always recognize that they have an interest in sharing or in opening data. With regards to governments, I think there are a couple of angles to this, one of which is that there is quite a strong relationship between transparency and citizen satisfaction with government. So at a general level, there are benefits for governments to embrace openness as part of their brand. Both in terms of satisfaction with political parties or with individual politicians, but also trust and satisfaction in government institutions. So there's that. And I think at a commercial level, here again, embracing the idea of good corporate citizenship, recognizing that there are often unlooked for opportunities, and the one that people always mention when they're talking about government data is ancestry. Nobody ever conceived that there could be such commercial value locked away in births, deaths, and marriage registries. So for commercial entities, for businesses, there may well be unlooked for opportunities for partnership, business opportunities that can be unlocked through the process of opening and sharing, collaborating.
Thank you. And now to you, Kateryna.
I really liked the question as well. I think there is no good incentive for government to publish data in terms of that. What we need to do is in any open data program or whatever, it's grow our community. We need to have a strong demand for open data. And actually, when I countries in the region, and why Ukraine is like special is that in Ukraine we have strong civil society, and actually community of open data users is growing, and we put a lot of efforts in it. It's like short-term efforts, long-term efforts. We constantly do trainings, challenges, hackathons, exactly focused on open data in different spheres. So maybe usually you don't feel immediate effect, but later on you see that the communities grow so much, then there is strong need for the data, the community unites and put the clear demand to the government, to particular ministry, to particular agency, and this is good intensive. So there is no like one golden solution. So if you want to open data in government, do this simple 3 steps. No, there is nothing like that. I work with so many ministries in Ukraine, in so many cities, many agencies. What I noticed that where we could build the community, where we could use the voice of community, where we can collaborate with community of businesses, NGOs, or so on, That's where this demand is there, and it's clearly articulated this demand. The government at some point, it just has no other choice but open. Sometimes it takes 1 month, sometimes it takes 2, and sometimes it takes a year. So it's unfortunately that when you have crisis, we don't have this luxury of having so much time as like in normal life. But in general, I think if only civil society can put pressure on the government, and government have to react. So this is it. So if any other person who develops the open data in program, the first advice I would say, build the allies network, talk to civil society, understand the users, the potential users of open data, understand what data they want, work in particular spheres, and invest your time in that community building, in network building, and actually at some point it will be super useful. So this is like how I see that should happen. But in terms of commercial publishing of open data, that's for me it's hard to answer at all, because in Ukraine it's still quite rare that this happens. Still rare. And actually this is an every event I usually ask business, so tell me, what do I need to tell you for you to open up the data? But trust me, I don't usually have the clear answer what they exactly need, and I ask it all the time. So no good answer. We just need to try different approaches to different business.
Thank you. But if I make as a follow-up question, now you are in the middle of a medical crisis, and the medical registries are, I mean, not unified. Let's say is an understatement, and there is some theoretical public demand to unify them, and it would make the treatment easier, and it still is not in place. And so in this specific case, do you think would this crisis assist to solve this to resolve specific disintegration of the registries, or it will also take some years in Ukraine?
Well, in Ukraine, Ministry of Digital Transformation did analysis of the state of the different registers in general in Ukraine. The state of those registers is quite poor. So unfortunately, right now, it's not a quick win. You cannot do it quickly. I think the crisis just showed where the priority should be. I think that's what it's highlighted. So if you have to, let's say, if you are a government body that have to make some registers better, integrate them, make them work properly, then maybe you'll see that the priority is different that you maybe thought before. And I think this is what is like, how do you prioritize a particular task to make sure that your registers functioning better, and so on.
Thank you, Kateryna. And now to you, Pavel. Please, in Kazakhstan, again, we have private sector, and as you've told, the big players collected enormous tons of information, like the cellular providers or the banks and others. And you have been more optimistic, saying that they're more eager to share the information, or to share the data, to make all this stuff more useful for the country development. So what are the incentives in your case of the central country in Central Asia, and what do you think would be the outcome of this pandemic for open data development there, and who do you think would be the first to share the data and the information through your agency or independently? Please unmute yourself, Pavel.
What a glitch, so I missed the first part of the question.
So the first part of the question was that you sound optimistic about the eagerness of the state agencies to share data and information, and you also told us that, and it's true, that in any country those who hold the information and data are not necessarily the state agencies, but it's also private banks and private cellular providers and others. Mm-hmm. So actually, the question was that what do you think would be the outcome of pandemic in Kazakhstan, in your specific case, as a central country in the Central Asia, with big players who are both governmental and not necessarily who are private owned? And what do you think would be the outcome, and from the perspective of your agency, of Zerde Holding, and also in general?
So we believe that the technocratic approach should work out the mess that we might have at the moment. So technically, if we're talking about like the digital architecture for the data collection, let's say, yeah, if there is a consensus in place of opening data, as much data as possible in place, so how we're gonna execute the process of like getting different information together. So I believe it should be like architecture, IT architecture approach. So we have to open APIs for different stakeholders like banks, like mobile operators, and make it much easier. I have a kind of background at IT business, and I see that sometimes speaking out of the idealistic things, and everybody around the table might agree with you, but at the same time, okay, when we go next to make it happen, let's say the availability of medical data as an example. So how it's going to happen? Like how we may infuse empathy in the process, because availability of the data, of medical data, it means that every single doctor in a very distant city of your country should have incentive to fill out the data, right? And then to the local authority, local bureaucrat to like verify the data, or create some additional stimulus, not overload the poor school teacher or doctor with like some additional paperwork. What I really observed, like from as a person who just jumped into the quasi-governmental sector and was very much in contact with the public servants like politicians and bureaucrats, that it's not kind of tension of people not to give these data. It's about like the clear answers how to make dissemination of the data happen. And it's a pure technocratic question rather than just the political or others. So if we carefully think about like structure, okay, how we're going to share the data, how we incentivize the for example, public and private sector, like, because they own this data. Of course, they want something back for the preferably money for this data. Of course, how to create the market for the data, how to do the trade of this data legally, like without any challenges. So these kind of things, I think we should focus on under the umbrella of the open data discussion today, because it's not about political tension and autocracies, as you mentioned, that okay, there's somebody like bad now hiding the data. No, it's the pure technological issue today, I believe. And if we step by step start creating the data flow and architecture of the data, if we can look at this map and see some missing points, so that will bring us to the situation. I can show you I believe in 2 years, the ideal case of data management on Kazakhstan example. Hopefully, if we will follow up with today's pace and projects and initiatives, and we will show that the technocratic approach is going to work out this problem.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you for this very interesting overview, and we'll get back to you in 2 years, believe me. So we'll see what was the outcome of all these developments. And thank you, Kateryna, and thank you, Dr. McMurren. Thank you for joining us today, and for our audience. And I think that now we know much better and much more optimistic about the open data development in Eurasian region. Thank you.